question of definitions, and one that increasingly needs redefining, more now than ever before. We'll be exploring the challenges that face the European Union, from the euro to immigration to transparency, and we'll try to discern what Europe looks like in the wake of Brexit's effects. The discussion will take the form of a Q&A directed by myself, and we'll end with 10 minutes of questions from the audience. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panel tonight. Simon Glendinning is Director of the Forum for European Philosophy in the European Institute at the LSE. His background is in philosophy, studying at York and Oxford, where he discovered Heidegger, phenomenology, and Derrida. His working in a social science environment at the LSE has pushed his work from European philosophy to a philosophy of Europe. This is the question of what is Europe, and where does it go in terms of philosophy, in terms of a philosophy of the history of the world. His forthcoming 2-volume book, Europe's Promise, traces the unraveling of Enlightenment Europe's cosmopolitan hopes. His research interests include European identity, European modernity, and European politics. We're indeed very lucky to have him here today. Neena Gill is a Labour member of the European Parliament for the West Midlands. She is currently serving her 3rd term in Parliament after spending over 18 years working in social housing in inner city areas across the UK. This is, of course, not the first encounter the King's think tank has had with Ms. Neena Gill, as she was kind enough to speak with us, to speak with our delegation that went to Brussels on a trip last year. There we learned of her passions for infrastructure, investment, and equality, as well as learning of the ways that she has integrated the EU with the West Midlands, from workers' rights to manufacturing products. We are very gifted to have her here on the panel today. Finally, Charles Grant is the director of the Centre for European Reform. In fact, he helped to found the institution in 1996 and became its first director in 1998 after leaving The Economist. During his time at The Economist, he exposed the County NatWest Blue Arrow scandal, which led to 2 Department of Trade and Industry inquiries and a long criminal trial. Today, he has been awarded numerous medals and orders from the governments of France, Poland, and Italy for his work on European policymaking. We're glad to have him on the panel today. Please give a warm welcome and a big thank you for our team. I want to open the discussion tonight with a question to Simon Glendinning. Emmanuel Levinas said, "Europe is the Bible and the Greeks." What does this mean with regard to the institutions of Europe, namely the European Union?
Europe is the Bible and the Greeks. It was an interesting, rather off-the-cuff remark that he made in an interview, but it has a particular interest because it's a philosophical remark rather than a historical remark. When historians think about Europe, they tend to think about it in terms of a kind of golden thread. Now, when the golden thread that I'm going to run through very rapidly is one that belongs to Europe already. So it's not like historians discovered it somehow, but when Europeans think about who they are historically, their self-understanding is one which gives themselves a history. And the history is very straightforward. It goes, you probably all know it, Greek, Roman, Christian, modern. And that's every single book in the world that's ever written on Europe will sort of structure itself in that way, in the movement between the Greek world, the Roman world, the Christian world, and the modern world. And of course, historians might then take more or less interest in other parts of the world in telling that story, but effectively that's, as it were, the dominant golden thread of Europe's history. Now, Levinas, when he said Europe is the Bible and the Greeks, he wasn't cutting out 2 of those sources. He was saying something else, which is an idea of not an origin, but what in Greek is called an arche, which is something more like a commencement, which is also a commandment. So something that doesn't just lie in the past, but is still there, as it were, governing the sway of whatever was opened up. And he's suggesting that what the space of a self-understanding in which Europe emerges is one which is a tradition as it were, more than one tradition, on the one hand something Greek, and on the other hand something biblical. Now, he wasn't sort of the first person to say this. Actually, I brought with me just one illustration of this from Matthew Arnold, who says something similar. Hebraism and Hellenism, between these 2 points of influence moves our world. So that idea of an opening up of a world from Greek philosophy and history and science and biblical, and for Europe especially Christian conceptions of value and also of history. Open up a space within which, as it were, the European world emerges and through which we understand ourselves. So Europe is the Bible and the Greeks in that way. One last point on that would be that what's especially important in that opening is a conception of who we are, where what we call ourselves when we say who we are is what Europeans call, in one language or another, man. So it's an understanding of man, so not a European man, but man as such. And on the Greek side, we've understood ourselves as, in the Greek, for anybody who understands Greek, zoon, logon, ekon, which got translated into the Latin of the Roman as animal rationale, for us, rational animal. So that's the Greek contribution to a self-understanding, and on the biblical side of the imago Dei, or made in the image of God. So we're sort of a theomorphic rational animality. That's what a human being is, and it's the way in which we've understood ourselves. And what happens in politics is that comes together, those two come together in the cosmopolitan tradition, that it comes down to us on the one hand from the Stoics, who, as Theresa May knew, said we are citizens of the world. So, as it were, no one is essentially another or a foreigner, ultimately. And on the Christian side, through St. Paul, the idea that we are all sons of God. We're all brothers. And so, again, we're not foreigners, we're all citizens of the world of some kind. So there's running through this European space is a political idea of a cosmopolitan hope. And if you can't see the European Union emerging in that, I don't know what I've said.
Thank you very much. Charles Grant, the Commission has appointed Michel Barnier as its chief representative in the Brexit negotiations, and the Council is in command of that, so it's not exactly clear what he will do. And in fact, with member states, domestic policy is increasingly playing a more important role than that of the European Council in driving whatever EU policy momentum exists. Is even an intergovernmental EU too much to hope for? And if not, if so, what will Europe end up with?
Well, ever since Monnet got the EU going in the early 1950s, the EU's been a balance between federal principles and institutions and intergovernmental principles and institutions. It's always been an uneasy balance, but there's been a clear trend in the last maybe 10 years, or nearly 10 years, for intergovernmentalism to become relatively more dominant in my view. And I think Brexit accentuates that. It's become more dominant, intergovernmentalism, because there's been a whole series of very serious crises, bigger crises than the EU's confronted before. First, the financial crisis of 2008, then the Eurozone crisis, then the refugee crisis, now Brexit. All these crises are so serious they have to be done by the heads of government, sorted out by the heads of government, who find the right compromises. And also for Eurozone bailouts, they provide the money from their national parliaments. So the Commission, although it's gained technical powers on the Eurozone crisis, and the Parliament's gained quite a lot of extra power with the Lisbon Treaty, and certainly done very well in many ways, I think the institutions have been put on the defensive by this intergovernmentalism. Brexit has accentuated this because it's put those who believe in integration on the defensive. We've seen, although populist parties have not won power anywhere in the EU, really, and arguably Hungary and Poland are rather populist, they haven't won power in most EU countries. Nevertheless, the centrist parties who run most EU countries are scared of the populists, and because they're scared of the populists, they're not pushing for more European integration because they know that would give red meat to the populists. And so they're not willing to see a much more integrated EU. Brexit has accentuated that effect. It has boosted and strengthened populism. So it means the ruling governments are even more worried about European integration. Meanwhile, France and Germany cannot agree on the way forward for the Eurozone. They are miles apart on what needs to happen. The French want a transfer union, a Eurozone budget, Eurobonds. The Germans want more fiscal discipline. They want to force the French and Italians to engage in structural reform. And Brexit worsens all this because post-Brexit, the general view set by Merkel and Tusk is there mustn't be too much divisive policy discussion. Let's go for a European Defence Corporation because we all agree on that. Let's not move forward in the Eurozone. So essentially, to sum up, I think Brexit has put the European institutions on the defensive. It's meant a much more rather more intergovernmental union, and that's been the trend for some time anyway. And I accept that the Parliament is perhaps a slight contradiction to my thesis because it's certainly very powerful and an important institution. It's rather the Commission that has been cowed by Brexit to some degree. And a consequence of an intergovernmental union is that the big countries call the shots. And that means Germany calls the shots. And Germany is very preponderant in the EU these days, which is not good for Germany. And of course, Brexit has only accentuated the rise of Germany because it's taken away another source of power in the EU. Ironically, this helps the French a bit, and I'll stop with this, because the Germans need the French to help them run the EU. So if the French want slack rules on budget deficits and want to be able to borrow a bit more, then the Germans are rather worried about upsetting the French too much, because if they do, the French could team up with the Italians and form a sort of counter-alliance to German power. So Germany runs the show, but it's very scared of France and Italy and others are lying against it, so it's having to be quite soft on some of the fiscal discipline.
Thank you. On that topic of who runs the show, a big issue is transparency around the EU. Neena Gill, I'd like to ask, in the past, the EU, especially the Commission, has forged ahead assuming that the public approved of what it was doing, whereas that was not always the case, as has been recently pointed out. What should the EU do now to earn the trust of its people?
I think I want to pick up where Charles left off first. I think in relation to Brexit, I think it's important to see how the institutions are evolving and changing. Is my microphone on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes. Okay. And I think the French certainly see it as an opportunity to step into what they see a vacuum that Britain will create. And there is a greater push, I feel, from the French to conclude discussions with UK very, very quickly so that they can build on. I would also add that they do see this as moving forward in creating ever closer union. I think it isn't that they've shelved that completely. I'm just going by the sort of conversations that are taking place in the corridors of Brussels and in the Parliament. What are the topics of seminars? And they do see that they have to reform. In fact, today, Martin Schulz was addressing the European Council. Those of you who don't know Martin Schulz, he's the President of the Parliament. And he was speaking to the Council today, and he was seeing Brexit as an opportunity for all of the EU institutions to really reform and change. Because we can't just say, look, let's just deal with UK and how it leaves, but it is important that we reform and think about how we could work closer together, because clearly the model that is there at the moment is flawed because of the intergovernmental nature of it, which means that it's harder for Brussels or to take decisions. So I've always maintained that part of the problem we have in Brussels is the fact that it is the governments, the member states, who often don't take the decisions and then blame Brussels for it. And this is why we need greater transparency, because most people do not know what decisions have been taken at council meetings. What tends to happen is governments, member states, and these are governments of every colour. It's not one particular type of government, but they will go there, they will reach decisions, or they will decide decisions either on Lisbon or on taxes or on refugees, and then they will go back and actually not implement it. And that is the big problem with the intergovernmental model as we have it. So I think greater transparency would certainly help, and there are a lot of measures that are being considered at the moment in terms of e-transparency, especially in relation to the Council. But having said that, I would actually also add that probably many of the institutions are very transparent, and that is not often realised, that, you know, in terms of all the ideas, the reports that the Parliament is looking at, debates in the committees, they're mostly web streamed, all the papers are available, and if you've got the resources, you can pretty much follow the entire legislation, other than when it comes to the Council or a few areas like trilogue. But I think part of the problem that the EU has is the visibility, the institutions of the EU, that they're not as visible. Most people that I met during the referendum could not really distinguish between the role of the Council and the Commission or the Parliament, and often the names were confused, and even that people confused the EU with the European Court of Human Rights. So there's a big job of work to be done in terms of the, you know, European institutions getting that understanding. I don't think it's peculiar to UK. I think you get this everywhere else as well, in other member states. So it's important that that issue is addressed. Visibility and, as I said, greater transparency, and especially with the Council.
Okay, Charles Grant, in 2013, you wrote How to Build a Modern European Union, and you argued that part of the problem was that the European Parliament pushes the Commission into making proposals that are on some occasions unnecessary. And you said the Commissioners should become less dependent on the MEPs. You went on to say that we do not think that yet more powers for the European Parliament, a body whose own legitimacy is in doubt, can help to make the EU as a whole more legitimate. After Brexit, is this still the case?
Yes, and I do obviously have a slightly different approach from Neena here. I mean, Neena says people are talking about more integration in the European Parliament. Well, they would do, because that's what the Parliament believes in, which is a perfectly respectable and legitimate thing to believe in. But it's not what they're talking about in Berlin, or yesterday I was in Helsinki, or in Paris either, as far as I can see. I think the age of believing that more integration is going to solve European problems is probably over, with certain exceptions. I would say handling the refugee crisis, you do need some integration, you need to create a border force, that's happening. In certain specific areas you need to do more. Arguably perhaps on the Eurozone, I'm a bit sceptical about that. And you're right, Neena, that having intergovernmental decision-making is sometimes inefficient. The trouble is, if you want a great leap forward towards a kind of more federal system of decision-making, say on the Eurozone, or foreign policy, I don't think the politicians have got the public support to do that. I don't think either the French or the German parliaments would vote for a much more integrated system of managing the Eurozone in terms of giving up power over national budgets, for example, which would be probably required. I mean, I certainly am with you that, of course, I'm not saying everything should be intergovernmental. The single market, policy, competition policy, trade policy, farm policy, lots of things should be done by the Commission or majority voting, and not, you shouldn't allow the member states to veto things. It's a question of where you draw the line in the compromise. Sorry, your question again was about Brexit. I've digressed.
If the Commissions should still remain less dependent on the MEPs after Brexit? Yes,
I do, because I'm a fan of the Commission. I wrote a biography of Jacques Delors a quarter of a century ago. I think the Commission is a good idea. It makes mistakes, but you need it. The EU could not work without it. And I lament the fact that in the key capitals, particularly France and Germany, but also others too, the Commission is much less popular than it used to be, and less respected than it used to be. And one of the reasons it's not respected is because post-Lisbon Treaty, post the invention of the Spitzenkandidaten, which gives the Parliament sort of the power to choose the Commission President, therefore the Commission's become in hoc to the Parliament on quite a few issues, not all issues. And so my view is the Commission is most powerful and most useful if it stands between the Parliament and the Council of Ministers as sort of balancing the two. In the last few years, I would say it's become the creature of the Parliament to some degree, and that's reduced its legitimacy in places like Berlin, which is actually not in the Commission's own interest. I'd like to see it assert more independence from the Parliament, but that may be unrealistic given you now have the system of Spitzenkandidaten whereby the Parliament chooses the Commission President.
Okay, and we touched earlier a bit on Germany and Germany's role in the EU. And I think this speaks to a larger theme of Germany in Europe. Simon Glendinning, I'd like to ask you, what does Nietzsche mean when he refers to good Europeans? And what does that have to do with the relationship between Germany and Europe? In the post-Brexit world, should Germany heed the calls of Habermas to avoid the temptations of leading Europe, in this case through the budget and the council, and allow a more intergovernmental approach?
Goodness me, Nietzsche.
You wrote it.
Yeah, I know, but I didn't write it to sort of read out like to a lot of people. Nietzsche was part of a line of thinkers, primarily, but not exclusively German, for whom the cosmopolitan hope idea that I illustrated a moment ago was very live. And he felt strongly in the 1880s that he was in a time where Europe wants to become one. And he had his own vision of what that unity would look like. He thought that ultimately nations would have the status of a canton, so it's like a kind of Swiss model for the whole of Europe, and that it would have a very strong centre, which would be state-like. So actually, in that respect, Nietzsche is not so far from somebody like Habermas, who also has a supranational model at the forefront of his vision of the future of Europe. And actually, rather than talk more about Nietzsche at this point, I think that it's important to come back to something that Charles said about a sort of ambiguity, or at least a double vision of Europe, of that cosmopolitan Europe, that's been inside its development from the start. And I'm sure you wanted to talk about ever closer union later, but I want to bring it out now, because when Nietzsche says Europe wants to become one, that should quite properly be understood as an ambition, a hope for ever closer union. But there really are two competing ways, not just federal and intergovernmental, but two competing ways in which that union and unity of Europe might be understood. One, which is the sort of Nietzschean Habermasian way, which is to talk about ever closer union as a movement towards establishing a supranational government. And that has been a part of European Union politics from the beginning, and it's one that Charles is suggesting has perhaps less future to it than had been thought some time ago. But the actual formulation is ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, where peoples is plural. And there's another kind of dynamic movement into the future which Europe has equally cherished in a way, which is a movement towards creating conditions of closer cooperation and understanding between peoples, where those peoples remain, as it were, in a plurality, and typically in nation-states. And the reason why that idea has been so important is because for centuries that was a space of peoples at war. And the crucial thought about the European Union in this sense is that it's what Kant had called, so another German thinker thinking about European unity, called a Pacific Federation. Not that it was stuck in the middle of the sea, but it was about peace. And there, what the ambition is not necessarily the production of a supranational government, but creating conditions which make war less likely. And both sides of the argument, as it were, the intergovernmental and federalist models, do understand themselves in that context. It can easily make sense to think that the best way to achieve cooperation and understanding between peoples, which makes war less likely, is to form a supranational government. But you could equally think, and indeed most philosophers in the history of philosophy have thought, that idea of having different nationalities under the same government was not just an ideal that could perhaps never be realised, but was actually a sort of opposite to an ideal. Kant called it the graveyard of freedom. Mill thought it was something that all it would promote would be conflict. So, ever closer union is the key to a cosmopolitan that belongs to European Union. However, I think that it remains the case that historically there have been these two lines of understanding. One, that it would be a relationship between nations through some intergovernmental structure. Another that thought it required a supranational structure. The philosophers en masse, apart from Habermas perhaps, who also called himself a sociologist, so he's perhaps excused, think that the dangers of supranational government are so manifest and dangerous that actually stopping short of that structure so that you have something which is not essentially state-like as the political body that's formed to institutionalise the union should remain like that, should remain something short of a state.
Thank you. And in terms of moving now towards discussing the budget after Brexit, I'd like to ask you, Neena Gill, as a member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, how do you think that the budget will change now that one of the key players, the key governments that put forth austerity, withdraws from the European Union?
Well, certainly Germany has lost an ally in this respect, but many other countries, and especially the southern countries, are sort of quietly relieved. But the key impact, the immediate impact, is of course in terms of our contributions now that they've already reduced given the fall in the value of pound. But I think the concern is what impact will it have in the longer term. It really depends on the sort of settlement we get, because it will create a big hole in the EU's budget, being the second largest contributors. I'm looking at Charles.
Well, I think we used to be. I think we and the French and the Italians are probably roughly equal.
Yeah. But I think, you know, what is important is some of the issues that we were at the forefront of trying to get across in terms of budget. So greater emphasis on excellence, so whether it was on research, greater emphasis on development aid. I'm concerned about the impact, you know, Britain leaving will have on the EU. Is one of the biggest aid donors in the world, and actually we've started being quite effective in terms of that aid. So if you look at all the political problems that we have to address, and it's at a time where there will be a major cut in the budget as and when we leave, clearly it will have consequences for the clout that EU has as to what it can do in the international fora. I think that is going to be a problem. But we may choose to continue to contribute if we want to buy our way to perhaps having access to the single market and other issues. So it's really too early to say as to what the implications are apart from immediate. One thing on the budget I should say is that we're in the process of reviewing. Everything is done in a kind of a multi-annual framework, and we're in the process of reviewing that framework at this present time. And whereas we were going for increase in resources, and especially on programs like Horizon 2020, which really impact sort of universities' research, and I think everybody is trying to figure out what will be the consequences, because clearly there are significant implications for research and development across the EU, not just in the UK.
Right, and so just in the interest of time, I want to skip over that a bit more and move to immigration. And Charles Grant, I'd like to ask you, the EU plan for incoming migrants, which seeks to share 160,000 asylum seekers around the 28-member bloc via mandatory quotas, has been fiercely opposed by many member states and was actually a key factor in the Brexit vote. How crucial is immigration of an issue, and how much stress is it putting on the EU?
It's putting huge stress, but we should be careful not to think that everybody on the continent of Europe thinks like the British do. The British have a particular problem with intra-EU migration. That was undoubtedly one of the reasons why they voted to leave the EU. They didn't want so many people coming from within the European Union. And they tend to say, I hear from politicians, Labour and Tory at the moment, well, the others in the continent must think like we do. When we negotiate our Brexit departure, then they'll probably allow us to maybe stay in the single market and restrict migration, because they all want to do it too. They're all moving the way we are, because obviously they have to think like we think. But that's just not true. Of course, it's true if you talk to Marine Le Pen or Geert Wilders or some of the populists or the Alternative for Deutschland. But it's not true for mainstream politicians. They are concerned about a different sort of migration. The big worry in Germany is Syrians and Afghans and Pakistanis and others coming across the Aegean. The big worry in Italy is North Africans and sub-Saharan Africans coming across from Libya. So we mustn't think that other people think like we do. Intra-EU migration is not a very big deal in most EU countries. There's a bit of hostility to it, but not a lot. On the point you raised about the quotas, yes, I mean, the EU has done better than it was doing in handling this problem with refugees. The obvious thing you need to do is strengthen the external border, and which the EU is doing, creating new border guards, new border forces, which is the right thing to do. You have to focus on your foreign policy and try and deal with the causes of migration. Obviously, that's very, very difficult. The EU is developing things called migration partnerships with countries like Chad and Niger, so that countries get paid money in return for kind of stopping sending the people here. I mean, it's difficult, but it's the right approach to focus on the sources of migration. You need to do that. And then you also probably, to defeat the smugglers who kill people by letting them drown, you need to actually have a mechanism for taking people out of camps in, say, Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan, or possibly North Africa in the future, and bring them into the EU to resettle them through a quota scheme. So that if you create a legal route in, then you kind of take away the rationale of the smugglers. Now, some of this is happening, some of this is not happening. What is not happening is a good redistribution mechanism, which the Commission, the Germans and the Italians want, so that the Germans don't take all the refugees, and the Central European countries have just refused to take refugees, basically, and that's a big issue. So that's not happening, which is very unfortunate. The last thing I'll say is that Turkey is very important for all of this, because Turkey is the source of is the transit country for people going from Syria into the EU. There has been a kind of dirty deal done between the EU and Turkey, whereby Turkey stops the flow and the EU gives it money. And in theory, the EU takes people out of camps in Turkey. And then those people who do come from Turkey to Greece get sent back to Turkey. And in the long run, Turkey gets visa-free access to the EU, which is a big demand of President Erdogan. This deal, though imperfect, is actually holding for now. And I think it probably will hold, because the Turks have an interest in it holding. And so long as it holds, the pressure is being taken off Germany, and the Balkan routes have also been closed. So the EU's done just enough to stop the refugee crisis collapsing the whole EU, which it looked like it might do at one point. But as with the Euro crisis, it hasn't done enough to make it look like an effective, well-functioning, efficient organisation. And I agree with you that the refugee crisis, like the Euro crisis, influenced the referendum. If the EU had handled both crises better, we might have voted the other way.
Could I say something on the...
Yeah, I was just about to ask you a question.
Well, I think I can just pick it up, actually. This idea that I actually agree with Charles is something like a British misunderstanding of the perception of intra-European migration. And a way you can illustrate this, which I find clarifying, is to look at something called Eurobarometer, which is a sort of social survey for across the European Union, almost semi-official social survey. And in particular, the questions there about identity, whether you see how you see yourself as. Do you see yourself as? You're only given 4 options, so not everybody takes them, but most people do. And the first one is to think about where you put yourself. The first one says, are you European only? Second one says, are you European and national, where the national one would be fitted out ready for you when you're filling out the survey. So for me it would have said British. So are you European and national? And then the next question is, are you national and European? So in that order. And then finally, are you national only? The numbers are amazing. We could sit here all day as you try to guess them, but the number for European only across the EU is very stable across all the member states, including the UK, is 2%. So 2% European only. European first, European and national, not much more, it's 6%. The next number is the biggest number on average, national and then European, which is 52%. Right, 52%, half, over half. And then finally, national only is 38%, which is quite a lot, yes, indeed. Now, the reason why the British misunderstanding can be seen to arise is that if you look at those bottom 2 figures, which is national and European, national only, that's 90%, 92% of Europeans think of themselves, as it were, in that way. With some national identification being very important, but with national and European as a very large part of that. The numbers for the UK are genuinely exceptional, although the average is exactly the same for those bottom 2 numbers, exactly the same as France, exactly the same as Germany and so on, and Italy. It's a very continuous line, they're exactly reversed. So in the national and European average, it's 52%, and then national only is 38%. In Britain, the national only is 52%, and the national and European...
Which was the vote in the referendum.
Exactly.
52%.
It was unbelievable when I saw that, okay, that's what it is. And also, but just to come back to what you were saying, if most continental Europeans, the idea of being national and European comes far more easily to a lot more people. And so issues around intra-European migration are that much more congenial and easy for them. Whereas in Britain, if you've got a national only figure of over half the population, then even the intra-European migration becomes a kind of problem.
And just briefly on immigration, how crucial, recently Viktor Orban has stood up in Hungarian parliament and said that immigration makes us lose our European values and identity the way frogs are cooked in slowly heating water. Quite simply, slowly there will be more and more Muslims and we will no longer recognize Europe. Simon Glendinning, do you think that immigration threatens a European identity?
No. So, of course, it's interesting when you take something like Levinas's formulation, which is Europe is the Bible of the Greeks. It looks like, and therefore, you start bringing in non-biblical traditions, non-Greco-biblical traditions. You're going to be dissolving, or what would the kind of evacuating the space of its basic character. When Derrida, who I haven't mentioned, when Derrida was reading this in Levinas, one of the things he said, it would be more prudent to say, and I think he was right to, Greek, Christian and beyond. And he said and the beyond for 2 reasons. One is that if you want to look in any kind of empirically accurate historical way, then you've got to be able to say that there's a very profound Judaic and Islamic influence already inside the European space. So it's not, to try to exclude that from the kind of setup that you're trying to describe is deeply misleading. But another sense of beyond, which in fact he took from Nietzsche, which is Greek, Christian and beyond, that beyond is not something from outside itself, but a possibility, an openness inside itself to a movement beyond itself. And you see this throughout European history of, and the Enlightenment's an absolute classic time in which it represents itself as breaking from itself, or from traditional ways of understanding, into these modern ones, into scientific, rational understanding. But it saw itself as it were, that this was a possibility that belonged to the space it was moving beyond. And so that idea of Greek, Christian and beyond is this possibility inside Europe to undergo it, to be in a kind of way faithful in a movement of self-transformation. Now, that could be threatened by all sorts of things, but it's not threatened per se by migration of anybody in particular.
Right, okay, and on to the final question before opening it up to Q&A for all of you. Neena Gill, on to foreign affairs. You sit on the delegation for relations with the US. You're also a substitute on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Your latest speeches have been on the Philippines regarding trade and human rights, in Somalia regarding their transitioning period. You've pushed for resolution, sorry, not revolution. Resolution.
I pushed for that too.
on Thailand, Sudan, and Rwanda most recently. How will the EU's foreign policy change after losing British influence, as well as US pressure through Britain?
I would say that in many ways the human rights element is one of the fundamental key values for Parliament. That is essential. I don't see that will change significantly as a result of us leaving, because often it was the UK that used to try and prevent some of these resolutions going forward because of trade interests or others. I mean, I think there is a very, very strong movement in the Parliament, and in fact it often runs counter to what the Commission and the Council are trying to do, because in situations like Philippines and Thailand. I think, in relation to how it will change is the point I made earlier, that there are going to be significantly fewer funds, and so the sort of clout that EU has will weaken to some degree, and the influence that we can have out there to change things. Now, this is really apparent when you go to certain parts of the world. If you go to Latin America, you will see that the European Union is the saviour. And it's very different when you get to Asia, because European Union is often identified as the sort of the big brother, because there's always resolutions about human rights and about democracy. So you get real difference in terms of how it is viewed. But I think in relation to Brexit, I mean, I used to hear around Asia, and especially in South Asia, that they used to marvel at how Europe had achieved this, because the difficulties they had in just getting a group of countries to talk about the problems that were common to their region. And I think many people are now concerned because either their connections were through UK and the impact that will have on their country, and I'm talking about India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, who really saw the UK as their kind of gateway into the EU and being able to influence policies, so there will be impact there. The Americans, I mean, I've just returned from New York, and the Americans are totally bewildered. I have not yet spoken to one person who understands what we are doing and where we're going, because they just don't get it, and they don't understand that Britain could have, in a way, shot itself in, let's say, both feet and cut off all its limbs. It is really hard for them to understand, and although in very many ways I think UK has seen itself as being a kind of bridge, and they did see that bridge between US and the rest of Europe. I think those dynamics are changing, and certainly my experience of meeting politicians and organisations, that they are looking for a 3-year withdrawal from UK and moving to making those links with other European countries. So I think the UK is going to be the real loser in terms of our influence in terms of international policy. And there are even questions, I mean, could we really hold on to our seat at the UN, especially if it's no longer UK, because one reason that we're able to hold that position is to kind of our link with Europe and not just UK. So if Scotland was to leave, could we really justify having, and I think there will be challenges from very many other regions and geographies to say, UK should shift and it should maybe go to the European Union. I don't know. These are all speculations, because until we know what Brexit looks like, it's very hard to say that these will be the implications. But I did want to say something on immigration. I mean, I know it took a long time to deal with the refugee crisis, but at the same time, in terms of Eurospeak, 9 months, it was quick. It was quite quick to get to the situation where we have border and security forces. I mean, only 2 weeks ago it was implemented. And the thing is that, Hungary and Orban, they are problems, but this is how the EU has always seen the UK. We never wanted to go along, and they found a fudge, they found a way, and I think in this situation they're going to find a way, which is that, okay, they're not able to get them to accept the number of refugees, but what they might do is to just make them pay a lot more towards the cost of all the border security forces, so that there will be a way that it's really addressed. But, speaking to colleagues in the Parliament, I would also want to support what Charles was saying earlier, that over there people just don't understand what problem we have with intra-EU migration. They just say to me, why don't you like Romanians? And I said, well, I like Romanians, but I think the issue that everybody is trying to address, and this is as much for the rest of Europe as here, is undercutting, where people are being exploited, where they are, the legislation that has been passed, where it hasn't been properly implemented. So those are the issues that there is a degree of consensus that we have to address. But there isn't this understanding of why is this a problem. And I would say that although, the intra-EU immigration was really played up by the Leave side, I know for a fact the real issue is to do with all immigration and not just to do with intra-EU. It is about migration. I know people were saying, well, I voted Leave, but I now realise my son's Greek girlfriend is going to be affected. But I didn't mean to do that. I just wanted to stop black and brown people. And that is, people have said that to me, and that is a fact. So I think we mustn't give too much credence to that it was immigration that was, immigration was an issue, that people were voting for all sorts of other issues in that referendum as well.
Okay, I'm sorry about this, but we'll have to leave that there. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to Q&As. We did start a bit late, but please give a very, very big round of applause for us. Done by the Law Society, Mind the Gap is on gender equality in the UK. Please come to that. Thank you very much for coming. If you have any questions,
not Law Society though, that's a bit awkward. There's already a Law Society, that's not us.
Fine, we're going to have Q&A.